So without further ado, let's begin tonight's program. Our faculty pub night presenter, as I said, is Dr. Douglas Christie. He has taught at LMU for over 25 years. From 2013 to 2015, he served as co-director with Jennifer Abe of LMU's Casa de la Mateada. Did I say that right? Mateada? Excellent. Study abroad program in Cordoba, Argentina. His research and scholarship focus on ancient Christian contemplative and mystical traditions with a particular interest in how they can serve as resources for contemporary thought and practice. He is the author of The Word in the Desert, Scripture and the Quest for Holiness in Early Christian Mysticism, The Blue Sapphire of the Mind, Notes for a Contemplative Ecology, and most recently, The Insurmountable Darkness of Love, Mysticism, Loss, and the Common Life. Very creative names, by the way, Doug. I really like these names. Excellent job. And he is a recipient of the NEH, Lilly, and Luce Fellowships for his scholarship on contemplative thought and practice. So please have everybody give him a nice hand and welcome Dr. Douglas.
Wow, what a great welcome. Okay, the tall guy has to lean over a little bit here. Rhonda, thank you. And I want to say special thanks to Rhonda. She's extraordinary. She's been here at LMU for a long time, and she's one of just the best, warmest presences on campus, and I appreciate working with you on this. And Dean Brancolini, I want to thank you. John Jackson. These pub nights are amazing, and our library is amazing, and this room is amazing. And so I really appreciate the invitation to be here. There are other people I want to thank, but I'm going to actually maybe launch in right now to saying something else, which is that I'm very happy to have three of my very favorite people at LMU up here with me. I had kind of ulterior motives in inviting them, one of which was I didn't want to be standing up here by myself. So Ruben Martinez, my brother in the desert, and someone with whom I've been, very accomplished writer, spoken word artist back in the day, musician. He's what they would call in baseball a five-tool player. He's got a lot of gifts, and we teach about every other year, of course, on the desert. And maybe I've learned as much from Ruben as anybody here at LMU, and I really appreciate you being here. Charlotte Radler, my dear colleague in theological studies and expert on Christian mysticism, but I don't want you to feel like her kind of scope of interest is limited by that. You sit down and talk to Charlotte Radler, an hour later, you're still talking about everything you can imagine possible to talk about. So Charlotte, I'm very happy for you to be here. Eric Haruki Swanson is a recent addition to our department, and those faculty here can attest to this. It sometimes happens that you hire someone in your department and you think, our department is such a better place now because this person is here. I felt that way about Eric ever since he arrived. He's a scholar of Buddhism. He's been a wonderful contributor to our department, and students here who've taken his animated spirituality classes and other courses in Buddhism can attest that he's a very, very fine teacher, a great colleague now. So thank you all for students, present and former, I can't tell you how happy I am that you're here. We have an ideal here at LMU that faculty should try as hard as they can to involve students in their research so it can be collaborative and integrative. And I've tried to do that myself over the years, but I think what that ideal doesn't even quite get at is how much we, the faculty here at LMU, find ourselves inspired and moved by our students continuously. I have felt that from the moment I arrived here. I'm actually leaving LMU at the end of this year, so I know, bye-bye. It had to happen, but what I want to say is, like, to work with students and to have them inform your work is also to be inspired by them and to feel their own courage, their own thoughtfulness, their own willingness to risk kind of flowing back toward you. And it makes you want to do better work. So I just want to say thank you to the students who are here. Really appreciate you. So the book. I might as well get this out of the way at the beginning. The cover and the title. Early reviews of a book often depend on first impressions, and that includes the cover. We could probably have an interesting focus group discussion tonight. What is this cover saying exactly? And you could give your own impressions back. One early review came to me from my eldest daughter, Julia. I sent her the book when it first appeared, not with any expectation that she would actually read it, but just as a little gesture. This is what your father gets up to sometimes down here in Los Angeles. A voicemail appeared soon after on my phone. Hello, it's me, your child. Just calling to congratulate you on your book, even though it is the most emo thing I have ever seen. But I love it. So there you have, there's the first review perhaps. And then a colleague at LMU, this was reported to me later by Jennifer, my wife, who saw the book somewhere on campus and saw Jennifer not long afterwards and looked at her and said, "What is it like to be married to someone like that?" No, I think that's an ambiguous, open-ended question. I never learned specifically what "like that" meant, nor have I received a good answer from Jennifer. And finally, I would say the whole time I was working on this book, it wasn't the easiest thing to respond to questions that came to me asking, what are you working on? I tried out various answers. You learn to be quick and get in there and get out quickly before somebody's eyes glaze over. And I settled on spiritual darkness. They tended to be very short conversations after that. Just, that's kind of the way it went. But it's an honest response. This book is about spiritual darkness. It's about all the places in our experience where we come up against the limits. This happens to me sometimes. Where we come up against the limits of our capacity to say what has happened to us, what it means, what it might mean. Oftentimes in these moments we feel ourselves to be hopelessly inarticulate. We can't say what's happening to us. And many of the traditions that I draw upon in this book, ancient Christian mystical traditions, have a wonderful response to that. And that is to lift up the power of what they call the ineffable, the unsayable. And in these traditions, the ineffable, or to say something is ineffable, or that you can't say fully what is happening to you, is not seen as a deficiency on your part at all. It's a recognition that what you are encountering is immense, and it's more than you could possibly ever hope to comprehend or give expression to. And it's also an invitation to stand in a place of awe before that immensity. So there's something about this work that has been drawing me, calling to me for some time now, and I want to tell you just a little story about that before I invite my friends up. And I'm going to do this by sharing a couple of images. I think it's the best way I can do it. This is a place very dear to me. It has been for a long time. Back in the day when I was a wild youth, I love that phrase. Wild youth. The students I teach don't really know this, that I refer to them that way sometimes. What are the wild youths up to today? Because I just love the wild energy coursing through them. No, when I recently graduated from university, yes, UC Santa Cruz, I'm a proud banana slug. I hitchhiked up the coast of California and ended up in this place, Redwoods Monastery. It's about 5 hours north of San Francisco. It's a community of Trappistine nuns. They originally came from Belgium. I'm not sure I could tell you, or I could have told you then, why I went there or what I was looking for, but there was some hunger in me I was trying to address, and it drew me to this place. It's become a critically important place and community for me across all the years of my life since I first arrived there in the late 1970s. I've shared it with family, with our children. We gather there every New Year's with friends and have a great monastic celebration, retreat/party. And it's here that I first really learned, I think, what it means to enter into the silence and into stillness and into emptiness. These are ideas that we more often associate, I think, with Buddhism than with Christianity. My colleague may address this in a moment. For me, it was really tremendously moving to discover that there was a place in my own tradition where I didn't have to say very much. I didn't have to try to figure things out. I could be in the silence and the stillness together with others and listen. And this became a great kind of guiding light in my life. It was also in Redwoods that I discovered the late medieval Flemish mystical tradition. The women who came here originally were from Flemish-speaking Belgium, and so they brought with them a love for people like John of Ruysbroek and Hadewig. These are very obscure figures I recognize, and then there were ideas that I encountered that I didn't really understand, but they stayed with me. Ruysbroek says at the end of his spiritual espousals, describing the place where one finds oneself when you've left behind all categories of understanding and meaning, he says, this is the dark silence in which all the loving are lost. This is the dark silence in which all the loving are lost. It's not a bleak idea for Ruysbroek. It's a kind of a coming home that he is describing. And Hadewig, his earlier contemporary, also Flemish-speaking, Begine. The Begines were some of the wild women of late medieval Christianity. They weren't living in monasteries. They weren't controlled by the clergy and the bishops. They had this kind of freedom and autonomy that has made them, I think, very important guides for us today, for many of us. Hadewig says at the end of one of her poems and couplets, we're invited into the deep, insurmountable darkness of love. This is what this life is about. We're invited into the deep, insurmountable darkness of love. Now, did 22-year-old me understand what this was about? Not at all. But I think it's also instructive to note that you can be moved by things at different moments of your life without completely understanding them, and then later you begin to digest them or come home to them with a different understanding. So that's something I just want to say. It's not easy for me to show this image, and when I say what it is, you'll understand. I refer to it in the book. This is the Black Door at La Perla. It was an infamous detention center in Argentina. During the so-called Dirty War, many hundreds, even thousands of Argentines were abducted, brought to La Perla, detained without any due process or rights, often tortured, and disappeared. And this is the door through which many of them passed on the last day of their lives. And in 2013, Jennifer and I, 4 of our 5 children, our cat, moved to Argentina. The university was starting a program called Casa de la Mateada, and they were looking for faculty help to get the program going. We were interested in this, and we weren't necessarily the ideal people to lead it. We didn't have a lot of experience in Latin America. Our Spanish was not strong, but we had a deep willingness, and plus there wasn't a big long line around the door of people who wanted to go. So they took a chance on us, and we arrived in 2013, and we were, and Ruben also participated in this program, and he may say something about that. We had these amazing students arrive to live and work with us in Argentina. And one of the things that we did early on, we were invited to go to La Perla by some of our Argentine friends, and it was a very unnerving experience. It wasn't the first time, I suppose, for almost any of us that we had encountered a place of great loss like this, but the fact that it was a place of such proximate and intimate meaning for our Argentine friends, it wasn't that far back in their shared history that this was all going on. It really, it stopped us from our usual habit of trying to say anything about what this place was or what it meant. It was a very important lesson for all of us who had arrived in this country that was not our own. We were welcomed warmly, but we also learned to practice a certain kind of humility and openness to what we couldn't easily understand or explain. La Perla proved to be an emblem of this. It brought us into a kind of silence that's not a monastic silence, but it's a silence of respect and regard for what the immensity of the loss that we were encountering. So these two places. Now, I would be the first to acknowledge that setting them down side by side can feel a little bit discordant. What does this monastic space of prayer have to do with this? It has become a site of memory, I would add. It's a place where people gather to remember and to find the nourishment they need to stand together and to stand against further injustice. The nuns I met at Redwoods, when I met them in the late 70s, they were working for Amnesty International from deep in the redwood forest. They were standing against the logging that was happening all around them that was trying to fell the ancient redwoods. There's something that connects these two places, or that started to connect these two places in my imagination. And so in Argentina, that's where I started thinking about these questions. What can darkness teach us about our own journey through this world, the capacity we have for standing with one another in love and solidarity? And I began working on this, and for the next several years, I just turned over these questions in my mind. First in Argentina, then returning here to Los Angeles. And what I'm going to do just briefly to conclude my remarks is just offer you some images. This is a book of places and moments. There's a lot of my own experience in the book. These are places where the questions crystallize for me. Some of them will be known to you, some of them are not. I'm just going to walk through them ever so briefly to give you an idea of how the thinking took hold, where it took hold. In December 2006, after my long after my long marriage had ended, and I found myself kind of at a loss. The sisters took me in, and I spent Christmas that year with them, trying to ask myself who I was now and who I might be. A year earlier, I had traveled to Egypt. I felt the rumblings of these questions emerging for me. I thought I was going to participate on a monastic dig, which I did, but the real reason for my journey was to wander lost in the desert so that I could think through what was emerging in my life. I didn't understand that at the time, but it was true. 2007, I spent about a month in a wilderness place in Northern California with my daughter, Julia. It was the first time we had been together in that configuration, and so once again, there was a moment for reflecting on the wild beauty of this place, but also what was changing in our lives and what we might be able to say to each other as we tried to walk forward in our lives. Argentina, 2014. My brother Ruben Martinez arrives from the Northern Hemisphere, and we're working with the students, of course, in Cordoba, but we take 7 days to travel in the Altiplano in the high desert of Argentina. And I don't know if either of us could say, even tonight, what is it about the desert? But we gave ourselves fully to this experience, and it was profoundly moving for both of us to be in this immensity. In 2016, I traveled to eastern Poland with my friend Ralph Black, who had discovered that his great-grandmother had been sent from Amsterdam, the Dutch theater, to Westerbork, a detention center, and then east to Poland to Sobibor. And he wanted to find out what had happened to her, and we agreed to go together. So that was also quite an extraordinary experience for me of accompaniment. He accompanied me, of course, too, but he was going through something far beyond anything I could really understand. My father died in 2016. One of the chapters takes up the question of how I accompanied him in his last year. That's him in his younger, sprier days. That's me looking up. Is it in wonder, in amazement, some flabbergastedness? That's the little me and my sister. But accompanying my father, it just opened up something in me that I could hardly give voice to. But I found myself drawn again to enter a certain kind of silence. And finally, Argentina again, or I would say back to Argentina. I'm going to read a very brief piece from the book, and then I'm going to ask my friends to come up here. This is toward the end of the chapter called The Common Life, which is where the whole book is heading. This idea that we find one another in darkness. We often find one another in darkness and find out how to stand with one another. We must, without sparing, lose all for all, says Hadabik. Everything must go. Your idea of yourself, your conception of God, everything. Only radical openness remains. Prayer becomes a space of utter vulnerability, loss, the ground of love, accompaniment, communion. How does the possibility of living this way arise in the soul? How does it eventually come to seem not only viable but necessary? Is it possible to choose it, or does it emerge mostly in response to the experience of loss, brokenness, and vulnerability, and the realization that the old, isolating ideal of self-sufficiency can no longer be sustained? How can loss open the way to a deeper apprehension of the meaning of love? I recall a day spent with the community at Nuestro Hogar Tres toward the end of our first year in Argentina, when I began to sense this so deeply. By then, we had become aware of the serious challenges facing the community, and to the extent that we could, responded to the invitation to share in their lives, witnessing for ourselves the courage dignity and resourcefulness with which they met these challenges. But there was also a continuous unfolding of joy. One day, a call came to our house. It was our friend Ale inviting us to join them for the upcoming celebration of Dia del Niño. The whole neighborhood would be there. Could we come? Of course. A few days later, we arrived, making our way slowly down the narrow dirt road toward the school. Hundreds of people were gathered outside, greeting one another, beginning to prepare for the day. Inside, it was the same. In every classroom, we encountered groups of children playing games, making musical instruments, or little crowns, painting faces. The hallways were also packed with children and parents on the move, seeking the next adventure, the next game, the next delight. Everyone lost inside the joy of the day, utterly lost, without care, at least for that moment. And those of us who had gathered to accompany them also lost ourselves, drawn into the swirling, exuberant, pulsing life of this moment. And yet there was stillness here too, a sense of time slowing down, especially in that moment when your eyes met the eyes of another, Sophia, or when the recognition of how to make a drum, or how to fold an origami crane, or how to construct and cook empanadas began to dawn in your consciousness. I remember thinking, everything that matters is here in this moment. A sense of kairos, the fullness of time, and koinonia, the beloved community. In that moment of abandon, of freedom from care, I began to sense in a new way what it feels like to move within and be carried by a great immensity. I really appreciate you I appreciate you being here. It's funny, books feel like sometimes they're these artifacts that, like, when did you write your book? Oh, 9 to 12, Monday through Friday, crank that sucker out. I mean, this book, and anybody who's tried to write and here can testify, it just cost me everything I had to try to locate myself honestly within these questions.
You're a close friend and you're a mentor. To have both of those things be happening at the same time, a friend and a mentor, sometimes that can be difficult terrain. But mostly, it's a beautiful terrain. We have come to share many landscapes. The desert, of course, which is what kindled our friendship in the first place. Argentina, where you and Jennifer Abe founded the late, great CASA program. Don't get me started about its demise. Why? In Cordoba, Argentina. Redwoods Abbey, the Trappistine monastery that he talked to you a bit about. That has been your spiritual home for a long time, decades, and which you shared with me. He shared this with me at a critical moment in my life. And that gesture of friendship and spiritual direction set me on a path that ultimately led to my returning to school as a graduate student here at Loyola in theology. And I can't talk too much about that because I have a couple incompletes, and one of the professors is here that I know the final page. But I will get to it, I promise you, Dr. Radler. So, first and foremost, there's gratitude for your friendship, mentorship, and accompaniment. And the book is as he just said, is a deeply personal one, and I'm so moved by the depths of your personal revelation in it. You're also at the same time asking critical, scholarly, theological questions. And these questions have no easy answers, and I'm really looking forward to Dr. Swanson's intervention here, because they seem to edge up in some ways to discourses that Western thought comes up against in the East sometimes. But so what really arrests me about the work, and this is something that we share in the classroom, he talked to you a little bit about the class that we teach, it's called Into the Desert. I believe there's some Into the Desert. Our cohort is here. Great to see you guys. We were just literally in the Mojave Desert a few weeks ago. Several of our students had a magical moment. The hell with the critical discourse. The magical moment out there. It was raining. There were veils of rain hanging from the sky like horses' tails, against this beautiful late afternoon sun coming down above the mountains in the west, and these wisps of rain, and on this beautiful sand dune that's called the Kelso Dunes, and we climbed up to the top of it, and we had a 360-degree view of the world, and it's the desert, so it's empty, but it's also full. And that's really what Into the Desert is about, and in so many ways, the spiritual darkness theme that is coursing through this book is about that paradox, about the fullness in the emptiness of the fullness. So the questions that you're asking, Douglas, among the biggest ones here, are, can these ancient texts, these ancient personalities, speak to us in our time of darkness? And it's a complicated question. Historians, well, there's a whole thing, in literary studies about the new historicism, and how do we look at ancient the texts from other times, and we have to read them in their context, and there's a dialogue across time, and what about our subjectivity, reading and trying to read across time into that subjectivity? So it's a leap. It's a leap into another kind of dark, right? And the two key words, you mentioned one of them, in the ineffable, on the one hand. The other key word that I note in your text is incommensurability, which is a term we bat around in the desert course quite a bit. So, the gaps between epochs, the gaps between North and South, First World and Developing World, you're on really complicated terrain. And you're writing anyway. And it's this gesture of facing the gaps, of facing a forlorn landscape of loss and violence and historical misunderstanding and injustice, and you come up from this tradition and you look out across it. You could have easily just turned away and just stuck in the 4th century. Just stayed there. Just stayed in the 4th century. That would have been a safe move. Right? Just tell us the story of the 4th century monks like 1,000 other theologians have done. But no, you're trying to put that tradition in dialogue with our own time and place. And it's a risky venture. You're putting yourself on the line as a scholar, but you're also making very clear that there's a personal spiritual journey for you as well. This is something of great value. And you are embodying something that is at the heart of the traditions of this university and of our church when it's at its best. And I'm proud to call you my colleague.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this space, and thank you all of you for being here today. It's still my 4th year here. I feel like a relatively new member of the community, especially with the COVID years. But Dr. Christie was the chair when I was hired, so I feel an insatiable debt to Doug for welcoming me into the department and into the community here. And I'm also teaching a course on comparative mysticism this semester for the first time. And in our class, we read this book, and Dr. Christie very kindly came to our class to talk about his book. And it was the most amazing discussion with the students. And it's a testament, I think, to the book and how the book really draws out these questions from our students. And we got into very personal, very deep discussions. So I think I had some kind of notes and that I was going to talk about, but in both presentations, it was just kind of a gesture toward I want to hear kind of the Buddhist side of things. So I'm going to try to. I didn't really prepare. I didn't think that this was going to be a space for me to kind of throw in my Buddhist background. But I think that you talked about ineffable, and I think we all associate the term emptiness with Buddhism. And as I was reading the book, I was thinking about this word ineffable. And ineffable, I think, usually refers to the inability to speak about ultimate reality or God, or this kind of unreachable truth. And I think what is so beautiful about this book is that it takes that sense of ineffability, and I think as we kind of saw in your presentation too, it takes that to not necessarily this ultimate goodness or truth, but the inability to speak about the loss that we encounter. And I think that is what makes the book so compelling, and draws, I think, at least me and my students into this because it's so personal. But also, so maybe thinking about Buddhism and science and emptiness. And I was kind of sitting there thinking, okay, what is emptiness or silence specifically in the Buddhist context? And I'm thinking of Vilamakirti Sutra, where what is ultimate truth? And the correct answer is a smile, it's silence, right? It's ineffable. And there's another famous story of the transmission of the Zen tradition, the lineage. And rather than transmitting through words, it's a transmission through mind and mind, and through a flower, a giving of a flower, and again, a smile on the face. And I'm thinking about these kind of Buddhist ideas of silence and ineffability, and in those contexts, again, silence is something that is from a place of comfort and peace and of truth, and being in that state of comfort. And I think that that's quite different from the silence that you're talking about here. Again, in kind of feeling the limitations of language to confront a sense of loss. And there's another term that comes out in the book called mono no aware, which is a Japanese term, a kind of aesthetic sensibility that goes back to the 10th century, which literally means kind of empathy toward things, and ineffability toward things. So mono is thing, a physical matter, and aware is empathy. And oftentimes you kind of associate it with the fall leaves, or for example, a reflection of the moon in your sake cup, right? It's a very a recognition that things are ineffable, or things are impermanent. And I think that sense of mono no aware it's a beautiful sentiment because, not because you're losing something, but it's because of that empathy toward loss. And that you're not just recognizing that the leaves are falling and will disappear, or that sake is going to be drunk and you're going to feel happy, but that beautiful moon isn't going to be there anymore. But it's the realization that you too, as a physical body, is also going to deteriorate and finally disappear someday. And I think there's that recognition of the mutual impermanence that's associated with that beauty. And I think that that's actually quite closer to the type of silence and emptiness that you're referring to in the book. And if you kind of maybe circle back to this idea of Buddhist doctrine or Buddhist philosophical positions, we just heard emptiness is fullness and fullness is emptiness. I think that comes from the Heart Sutra, where there's a recognition that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And again, it's not dwelling in emptiness as this abstract truth that can't be spoken of, but it's also this very concrete thing that we can't have ultimate truth without the concreteness of reality and embodied experience. And I think what your book so beautifully does is really bring forward the embodied experience of pain and loss, and thinking about how we today deal with that. So I think that so that's more of a comment, just kind of thinking of things that was going on as I was sitting there. And I think maybe I also, because there's so many beautiful passages in the book, I want to kind of read, rather than kind of share my own comments. I think reading passages straight from the book, I think is just a great way to kind of get us all thinking about this. But I think there's maybe, I was going to plan on saying more things, but just in lieu of time, I think I want to think about a deep listening and the importance of the communal that you really highlight in the book. And by listening deeply, I think you point to, early on in your book, the possibility of listening deeply to and being shaped by ancient spiritual traditions. And I think that distance to the past and how you're kind of dealing with the past to think about the present. And on page 42, you're talking about the work of retrieval. And I think you so beautifully put it. You say, such work of retrieval need not, I think, be rooted in nostalgia for a long past. Rather, it can be understood as a part of a creative, constructive project of reimagining pre-modern and early modern contemplative and aesthetic traditions in terms that are faithful in their own distinctive life worlds, but that also help us think more deeply about the challenges we face in our own historical moment. At its best, this work takes seriously the historical specificity of particular spiritual expressions, but also remains open to their capacity to reveal something new and unexpected to us, and move and change us. And so I think this I guess you can say, an orientation as a scholar who's writing about these mystical traditions and really thinking about the application of their teachings for us today, I think is such an important contribution of the book. And I was just talking to Jennifer Abe before, and we were just talking about the voice that you use in this book, and how the voice that you, the deeply personal voice that you use is I think related to that kind of the orientation as a scholar. And it really points to a new form, I think, of scholarship. Really, Jennifer was saying, we don't really see this type of scholarship in psychology, and my response was, we don't really see this in Buddhist studies either. I mean, it's just such a unique voice. And so I don't know if we're allowed to ask questions, but maybe as something I would love to hear more about is that importance of the voice that you choose in writing this book. And I think you mentioned the chapter where you talk about your death of your father and how you're and I thought that was just a really moving chapter. And as I was reading this book in preparation for my class, there were moments when I was like, oh, why are there tears falling on the page? It was really moving. And I'm maybe I'm wondering whether or not I should read it, because every time I kind of read it, I do kind of feel a move to the point of and it's such a simple line, and I just want to share this with everybody. So on page 197, he says, kind of after he's shared his story of sitting with his father, and he says, I wonder, is this one of my gifts? Is it one of the gifts of my father is this one of the gifts of my Father that is giving me here at the end of his life, reminding me by his presence, his life, and the life he has given to me, and now by his fragility of utter preciousness of existence, and of the need to open my soul more fully to this gift. I know this already, or I think I do, but I can feel myself being called to a deeper into awareness of this truth by his impending death. And at the very final page of the chapter, I think Dr. Christie, has this very short, and in a way it feels almost, well, I'm going to read it first. He says, "These days I think often of my father and my own innocence. It is mostly lost now, surfacing in the unexpected moments when I recall who I was in his presence. A child filled with wonder, open, alive, curious. Perhaps it's not completely lost after all." And just one final kind of reflection is the importance of community and of the communal. And I think oftentimes when we think about mystics, especially in the Buddhist context, we think about the contemplative practice happening as a solitary practice, maybe somebody in the forest or the mountains by themselves. But I think what you really do in this book is really emphasize the importance of love and community, which I thought was a beautiful thing to be attentive to. And again, I'm just going to read a couple passages here from the chapter Common Life, page 213. It says, "Can community be nourished in solitude and stillness? Or to reframe the question slightly differently, is community possible without a deep feeling for the unity that binds us to one another?" And a little bit later, "Contemplative practice, in the sense I am considering it here, refers to a wordless apprehension of God in and through all that exists, an encounter with a nameless ground whose depth and breadth invites a radical relinquishment of the self into a great immensity. It is both deeply personal and communal, inclusive of the whole of reality. It moves us inward into the depths of human consciousness and outward toward a fuller engagement with one's fellow human beings and wider world. To reckon honestly with oneself and with God in silence and darkness means learning to live in God and in and for the world at the deepest possible level." And I think that this kind of idea, too, of this sense of darkness leading to actually a sense of interconnection is also something that I noticed in relation to Buddhism, where there's a very beautiful, especially in the esoteric Buddhist tradition that I'm most familiar with, there's a very beautiful a mandala, a painting of the universal Buddha in the middle, surrounded by other Buddhas and bodhisattvas and all these other living beings of the cosmos. And in the commentary of the text on which this mandala is based, it asks the question, what is ultimate truth? What is the knowledge that we're supposed to get out of this practice? And the answer to that is it's the realization of the three equals and the equality of yourself to the Buddha, but also the equality of yourself and the Buddha in the mind of all sentient beings. And so by understanding emptiness, it opens up a realization of your connection with all other beings, not only your relationship with God, but with the community that you're in, beyond the community that you're in. And it really asks us to think about what is the goal of practice, what is the goal of the spiritual path. And it's not about self-cultivation only, but it's about cultivating yourself in order to recognize your connection with the world around you. And I think that's one of the wonderful things that this book does. And I think it also begs us to consider how we living today can think about that, the spiritual sense of community. So I want to thank you for writing such a beautiful book and giving me the chance to share my thoughts today. So thank you so much. Thank you.
So, can you hear me? Because I have a very soft voice. Whatever. As long as you can hear me. Oh, good. Okay. So, first, of course, I want to thank Doug for inviting me to respond to this book that has meant so much to me, has meant so much to me because it was part of reading the chapters as it took form, as I will talk about. I also want to thank the library for its hospitality. Looking at you, Founder Wilson. So first, a little preamble. I'm going to probably read parts of my comments. And the reason why is that this is exceedingly emotional for me. Not to get competitive, Ruben, but I've known it for 20 years. So Doug was on my search committee, and when I was flown into campus, he picked me up, and in true Doug fashion, where did he take me? To the wetlands. And that was our first stop. And we stood there in silence and just let the beauty wash over us. And it was just ineffable. So it's also, of course, emotional because now after all these years working together, you will retire not until May, and it's almost Christological for me. There was never a time when he was not in this department. I don't know this department without you. I don't know this university without you. So I hope you forgive me for reading some of the passages, because I want to preserve some of my dignity. This long, getting older. So, for me, I've had the profound pleasure of seeing this book take form over the last couple of years. As I indicated, I've read several chapters. There are different stages of chrysalis, and it's simply wonderful to just stand here with a final instantiation in your hand, in my hand. The book is episodic in nature and hovers around the intersection of mystical, personal, and historical darkness. Doug and I have long shared an affection for and been engaged in conversations about our beloved 13th and 14th German and Flemish mystics. Just to mention some, Meister Eckhart Hadewitsch of Antwerp and Jan van Ruysbroek. And the latter has probably influenced Doug the most. So in this book, the texts of the medieval mystics become lenses through which Doug reads and rereads episodes and relationships in his life. And he allows himself to sink deeply into and linger in the coincidence of his own and their experiences of loss and longing. So the insurmountable darkness of love is a profoundly beautiful, sometimes painful, and chronologically fluid book. And importantly, it's also the most personal book that Doug has written to this point. For me, 2 chapters were particularly evocative, and I'm going to focus on them. The first one is The Weight of Emptiness, and which talked about, you saw the picture of the entrance, the foreboding entrance into La Perla. So it talks about La Perla, I can't pronounce it, and which is was an infamous detention center outside of Cordoba, Argentina, and also all of those who disappeared had lost their lives. And then the other one is On the Dark Path, which is about Doug's and his friend Ralph Black's journey from Amsterdam to Poland, which becomes an increasingly incomprehensible comprehension about the fate of his great-grandmother Sabina in the Nazi death camps. So these chapters resonate with me in part because of the weightiness of the topics, which you are unable to escape, right? But also in part because these chapters have a profound personal meaning for me. Since Doug interweaves mystical discourse with his own personal narrative, my response will also, albeit briefly, take on a personal form. Not to take the light of Doug's book, because that's where we're here, and I'm not suffering from main character syndrome, so don't worry. But to ultimately get to one of the questions, or actually several of the questions that Doug asks in the book. So, both The Weight of Emptiness and On the Dark Path take place in an elsewhere that is both deeply familiar to me, yet has always remained obscured in its own cloud of unknowing and silence. My own father was born in Theresienstadt concentration camp, yet in the final desperate moments of the Second World War on the East Front, his mother and my father were sent to a work camp in Poland to, for lack of a better descriptor, live and experience the liberation of work. However, his father was sent on to Auschwitz and disappeared. So this is my own dark path, in a sense. And it's also a dark path because no one wants to talk about it in the family. But I also have my own weight of emptiness. And this is a paradox. This is the paradox of my life. So as my grandmother, my father's mother, descended into madness after the war, she left my father in what is now former East Germany and went back to Vienna. She just left him. He was essentially orphaned. And my father then, as he was studying ethics, became one of the most notorious spies for the Stasi, the East German Ministry of Security, where the information that he provided led to the imprisonment, disappearance, suicide, and death of regime critics. There is a file that's about 2,500 pages long, i.e. longer than one on JFK and Martin Luther King, and they believe half of it has been destroyed. So why am I bringing this up? Well, these are shards of my narrative that I have not, as of yet, been able to make into something coherent. And yet, the honest accounting in Doug's book has showed me the possibility of a narrative about the unfathomable if you release it to be altered by its descent into darkness. And you also connect this quote to a beautiful quote by Paul Celan. I won't read it in its entirety, but Paul Celan, of course, engages in a discussion about the possibility of writing poetry post-Holocaust. And Paul Celan states that language has to pass through in its answerlessness, but it has to pass through the happening. And if you want to see the full quote, it is on page 153. So now I want to just read a passage from 118 where Doug poses several questions for us, and I assume actually, to a certain extent, not a certain extent, to yourself, right? So, let me see, 118. I began to wonder, could the deep respect for the unsayable embedded in these mystical texts help open up a space for thinking about, encountering, and responding to the ineffable darkness of La Perla and all those other places of collected laws in which we find ourselves continuously descending? And could the witness of those who entered the darkness to stand with the disappeared provide a new way of thinking about the vision of love at the heart of this mystical experience? Could a recovery of this negative space help us rekindle empathy for one another and the courage to reimagine and re-inhabit what Ruysbroeck calls the fathomless abyss of love? And so I want to end my initial reflections by inviting Doug and others to think further with us about the possibilities of what you posit here, right? And also the difficulties, of course. What are your thoughts now as you sit several months later here at Cub Night, holding the book in your hand and discussing it and having it embraced by the community here? That's one question. So, just like one. So, well, thank you so much.
So nobody followed directions tonight, including me, and I'm sorry about that, and yet this is what we have been given to reflect on. I think we're almost at time, in fact, and do we have 10 more minutes or so? Okay,
Yes,
so what I would really prefer is to hear from any of you who would like to comment, and you can put a question, you can make a comment. I'd rather not take up any more space responding to anything. I'd just love to hear your comments and thoughts and questions. So if that's okay with you, we'll take a little time with that. Is that okay with you, Rhonda?
It's your program.
Thank you. So please, it's over to you.
If you'd like to, sure. We'd like to hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for writing the book. After reading it, what I think I appreciate most about it is I gotta breathe. I'm like nervous. You have such a sensitivity to standing in solidarity with parts of society that often we don't want to think about. And I think having that sensitivity and being in solidarity, as you talk about through the lens of mysticism, reminds me of what it really means to love. And I think that's a deeply powerful thing, and what an amazing contribution you have given. Thank you.
That's one of our wonderful LMU students.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation, for your book, and for the dialogue here tonight. There's something that you said, Doug, at the beginning that I wrote down and circled, and then found myself writing what others were saying in relation to it. And it's that sometimes we experience things that are, quote, hopelessly inarticulate. We cannot say what is happening to us. And I was thinking about those lines. I know these lines very well personally, as do you, as do many of us in this room. And in relation to the smile in Buddhism and the lack of coherency that you were talking about, Charlotte. And I kept getting this image in my head throughout everyone's discussion, which is interesting because I think this is the first room I've ever been in at LMU where it's not in our faces, but I'm thinking of Jesus on the cross. I'm a New Testament scholar, so my brain goes there quite quickly, but I'm in particular thinking about Jesus on the cross in the Gospel of John. And in John's Gospel, Jesus is silent. He cannot speak in his final moments. Contra, for example, the Gospel of Mark, where his last moment is a death scream. It is a scream of agony. And in biblical scholarship, those two are compared, and often Mark's Jesus is named the pained Jesus, and John's Jesus is named the okay one, the smiling one. He's got his sake. He's above pain. He's above anguish. And I often wonder what might happen if we thought about his lack of speech otherwise. What if his lack of being able to say something is pointing to the fact that he's not filled with sake on the inside, he's filled with the fluid of his own body that will culminate in the collapse of his insides. And so what conversations could be had if we followed your understanding of that which is unsayable?
So to pick on something that Ruben mentioned, a paradox, it struck me, Doug, that for you, on the basis of this presentation, that stillness involved a lot of movement, a lot of travel, and that silence produced a substantial number of words, and that darkness was associated with an immense amount of images. So I'm wondering that paradox, those series of paradoxes, whether they're also present in your Hadovich and your Rusbrook, and if they are which. And I actually started to wonder if they moved around, among other things, and whether you think that those paradoxes that, according to what I perceive today, are evident in your own expression in this book, are present in the sources or some of those on which you drew. And if so, what that all might mean.
Well, okay. Yeah, that's very funny to have that pointed out. Stillness and movement. I mean, we have the wonderful word paradox. I'm grateful we have it. Sometimes a paradox can become a contradiction, and then you're in a different kind of space. Some of the mystics did move, and some of their lives were quite precarious. What we can tell of them, they didn't all live in enclosed monastic spaces, and some of them met a bitter end because their inner movement took them into a very risky place. You know all this. I'm talking to a great medieval scholar of the Cistercian tradition here. She knows all this, but this is something also that maybe we associate more with Buddhism. At Redwoods Monastery for years, they were influenced by their own contact with Zen Buddhism, so the periods when we would sit together in silence would also be punctuated by a gentle, steady circumambulation of the sacred space. And that became part of the practice with students in Argentina as well. I came to feel, we had something called Spirituality Night It's great. You have something different for every night of the week. Tuesday's taco night, Thursday's spirituality night. Anyway, we laughed about it a lot. But we just sat one night a week apart, and it was typical student time. It was like 10 p.m. or something. You know, I'm already like in bed, and I get up and I go over to their house, and we have spirituality night. But the last semester we were there, something told me that with everything that was going on, it was more important to create a space of silence than it was to conjure up spiritual activities. That was just my own inclination. And yet, we also walked together in the space of this Kinsho. And I don't know, it kind of captured something important about the whole experience. Every day, these students were out, you know, often with their hair on fire, trying to kind of cope with this incredible world they've been invited into, and all of us as well. And then we returned to a place of stillness where we tried to let the experience gather. And so stillness and movement became part of a kind of dance that we all engaged in. And I think it helped us a lot, actually. I mean, to stay grounded. Yeah, that's what I would say. Colleagues, any comment on the great paradoxes that Dr. Harrison has brought to us? I would love to hear one or two more thoughts from you all.
I've got it.
Here, I'll do the studio. Come on.
Hi. So I was just wondering, because typically when I think of academics, and as I've been in college, I'm a first year, so I'm, kind of doing all this stuff, I'm doing activity, and it's interesting to me that I find myself feeling more at home in this activity and in the chaos than in the stillness that we've been talking about, in the spiritual darkness. And I think it's interesting to me, especially as we think about what I'm going to call the enthalpy of ourselves, we tend towards stillness, just as the universe tends towards heat death and conformity, as everything loses energy and moves to the most stable state. I believe that we often find ourselves just kind of slowly moving as we get older towards more and more stillness. And so I was wondering, why do you think we feel less at home in that, and what is somewhat of our natural state, than in the activity?
I mean, that's just amazing. I won't even attempt a really full response to that. I don't know if I have one. Stillness is also, it can be a misnomer, because when you're still in meditation, you're breathing, your body is alive, you're conscious, you're not moving toward entropy, at least not yet. And then it's also often a pause in the midst of movement. So it's not something that can be defined on its own terms, that this is what it is. It's a way of slowing down to pay attention, to let consciousness gather, to catch up with yourself. You can be still in the presence of others and not say a word and discover things that you couldn't possibly discover unless you entered into that stillness. There's a lot of life in stillness, I think. And that's my response.
I was just gonna make. I'll go.
Okay. Letting someone else take it.
I'll go.
I think the feeling of the darkness, the sharing of your book, I think that happens everywhere and every time. The story you told at the La Plata, or the story you told at Auschwitz, also happened in the country, in my country, Vietnam. After 75, the detention camp, the torture, the killing, the disappearance of people. We have experienced that, but we have no definition. but the way you lead us spiritually, contemplation on that, not to hatred, but to reconciliation. We have that true feeling. I think that you are very fond of John Rupert and also maybe Dr. Rather on Master Eckhart, but I have been deeply read that, and I feel that teach me a lot in terms of mysticism on that. Thank you.
I was letting him go first because I just wanted to make the comment.
Okay.
Great Kevin, Sean. Gentlemen.
I'm gonna stand up. Nobody here knows me. But I was LMU class of 2021. I had the pleasure of taking Dr. Christie and Dr. Ave's class, Contemplatives in Action, in starting January of 2020. So we transitioned into COVID at that time, and I just wanted to say thank you. It's an emotional night, you know? I don't think anything could have prepared me for this pandemic and the loss and the silence better than your class. And we have had very emotional times in your class. I think 2020 was just a hell of a year. Still feels like I'm stuck there. But, you know, I've cried to you, both of you guys. I've opened up about my father having cancer. I've opened up about my loss. And in the darkest times of 2020, I remember sitting down outside my apartment in the silence, just staring off into the darkness. I was practicing everything you told me. Contemplatives in Action. Ruben, you helped as well. You talked to me about the silence of the desert and how you sat with yourself and you thought you heard a snake. But it just turns out that it was the blood running through you. It was amazing. You could hear and identify in the silence. And in that silence and in that darkness, I found my answer. I had spent my entire life living frantically scared of death. And in that moment, I found my answer. I can only live for love and my love of others. And it's embracing that darkness and that silence and the fullness of the emptiness. And so I just want to say thank you. I'm a testament to how your time at LMU here has been. You have been the most impactful professor of my life. And I owe you so much. Thank you.
I can't think of anything nicer to hear as an educator to get that kind of response. It's really lovely. We're going to wrap it up tonight. I have to say that even though Doug gave me a lot of credit, this really was his program from the get-go, and he was so patient with me. And every time I would go this way, he would very quietly go that way. And he proved himself to be an absolutely wonderful party planner, because this was really a very lovely affair, a really great event that will be recorded and remain in our archives forever, and I'm so glad for that. So thank you very much. I also want to say thank you for the photos, because as I was reading your book, I was reading it and trying to picture some of these places, and I'm just too visual a person. I need to see visuals, and to see the Redwood Monastery and to see the desert and Argentina and those faces of the children is just lovely. So thank you for the images. It was really like a gift for me. I would like to remind you all, please, to fill out our little evaluation forms if possible. I will give you a minute or two to do that as I wrap up. I would like to thank all of our speakers tonight. Dr. Charlotte Radler, Dr. Luke Martinez,